Some men walk into a room and take up space. You notice them the way you notice weather. Before they arrive, something in the air already shifted. Alexei Moro was that kind of man. Not loud, not performing, just present, in a way that made everything else feel slightly less real. I had heard his name exactly once before I met him, in a tone that told me everything I needed to know. Lower your eyes, mind your business, and don't. I was not the kind of woman who ignored warnings. I was also not the kind of woman who had ever been looked at the way he looked at me that night in the dark, when the power was out and the building was quiet, and there was nothing between us but stillness and the sound of my own breathing. I didn't know yet what that look would cost me. I didn't know yet that a single smile from a man like him could rearrange something inside you that you'd spent years carefully putting in order. This is that story. And if you've ever been seen by someone you weren't supposed to notice, really seen, in the way that feels less like a gift and more like a warning, then you already know how it ends. You stay anyway. Before we get into it, if you're new here, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a like if you're already feeling this one, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It genuinely means everything, and it's what keeps these stories coming. Now, let's go back to the night the lights went out in the Ashford Tower, and the night Alexei Moro smiled at me for the first and only time. I wish I could tell you I looked away. I didn't. The Ashford Tower had a way of making you feel small without trying. It wasn't the marble floors or the ceiling height or the way the front desk staff moved like they'd been trained by someone who had opinions about posture. It was the silence, the kind that costs money. I had been working there for 11 days when I started to understand that silence wasn't just an aesthetic, it was a rule. My name is Calla Dresser, and I was hired as the building's operational supervisor, which is a formal way of saying I was the person who got called when something stopped working. The elevators, the HVAC, the water pressure on the 19th floor, that was me. I didn't mind it. Honestly, I preferred problems that had solutions. My personal life had handed me enough of the other kind. I was 32, living in a one-bedroom in Astoria that I liked well enough, close to my younger sister and far enough from my mother to call that a coincidence. I wasn't unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I just had the specific kind of loneliness that comes from being reliably competent. The kind where people trust you completely and need you often, and somehow still manage to look through you at the same time. I had gotten used to it. Some mornings that felt like peace. Other mornings it felt like something else entirely. The Ashford kept me busy, which helped. I was managing a vendor dispute on the 14th floor when my supervisor, Derek, stopped by my office with the expression he wore when he needed something he didn't want to ask for directly. He told me that the resident in the penthouse had submitted a formal request. He wanted a single point of contact for all building matters going forward. He had specified, in writing, that it should be the staff member who handled the power failure on November 4th. That was me. I hadn't even known he was there that night. I remembered the outage, a relay issue in the basement control room. 40 minutes to fix. No one else around at 11 p.m., because I hadn't called anyone in because I didn't need to. I remembered the moment the backup lights came on, and I turned around and there was a man standing in the doorway I hadn't heard open. Tall, still, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. I had assumed he was maintenance. He was not maintenance. Derek slid a folder across my desk with the resident's name on the tab. Alexei Moro, Penthouse 42. I looked at the folder without opening it. Did he say why? Derek's answer was a short, uncomfortable laugh. He doesn't explain himself. I picked up the folder. opened it. His photo was a formality, a building registration image, plain background. It didn't matter. I already remembered exactly what he looked like standing in that doorway. And the part I hadn't told anyone, the part I'd barely admitted to myself, was that he had smiled. Just once. Just barely. And I had thought about it every day since. The first meeting was scheduled for Monday at 10. Derek had made that clear, along with a list of unspoken expectations delivered entirely through tone. Be professional. Be brief. Don't make this complicated. I didn't plan to. I took the private elevator to the 42nd floor with a clipboard, a pen, and the specific kind of focus I used when I needed to not think about something. The elevator opened directly into a foyer. No hallway, no shared corridor, just a door, and beyond it, the quiet that existed at that altitude felt different from the rest of the building. Heavier. I knocked. He opened the door himself, which I hadn't expected. I don't know what I had expected. A assistant? A housekeeper? Someone whose job was to exist between him and the rest of the world. But it was just him. Dark sweater, no tie, the kind of composed that isn't performed. He looked at me the way people look at something they've already decided about. "Ms. Dresser?" he said. Not a question. I said good morning, and he stepped back to let me in without responding to that. The apartment was large, and largely empty in the way that expensive spaces sometimes are. Not sparse, but deliberate. Everything in its place, nothing decorative that didn't serve a purpose. I noticed all of this in approximately 4 seconds, because it was easier than noticing him. He gestured toward the seating area near the windows, and I sat across from him with my clipboard on my knee and went through the list. Maintenance schedule, vendor access, emergency contacts. He listened without interrupting, which sounds like basic courtesy, but somehow felt like more than that. Like he was actually paying attention in a way people usually reserved for things that mattered to them. I asked if he had specific preferences about timing for routine checks. He said mornings were fine. I asked about the service entrance. He said he didn't have restrictions. I was almost done when he said, without any particular lead-in, "You fixed the relay yourself." It wasn't a question either. I glanced up from the clipboard. It wasn't complicated. "You were here at 11 p.m., alone. The repair didn't require 2 people. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but interest. The specific kind that feels like the beginning of a problem. He said, "Most people would have waited until morning." I said, "Most people didn't have my job," and he was quiet for a moment after that. Not uncomfortable quiet, thinking quiet. I finished the checklist and stood up, and he walked me back to the elevator, which again I hadn't expected. We stood there for a moment while the elevator came up, and I was very aware of the distance between us, which was appropriate and professional, and somehow still felt like not enough space. The doors opened. I stepped in. He didn't move to follow, just stood there with one hand resting against the door frame. He said, "Same time next week." I nodded, and the doors closed, and I stared at my own reflection in the elevator mirror for 37 floors and tried to locate exactly when that conversation had stopped feeling like work. I couldn't find the moment. That was the part that stayed with me. The weekly meetings became a pattern before I noticed they had. Every Monday at 10, private elevator, 42nd floor. I brought updates he didn't strictly need. He never raised issues, never complained, never asked for anything beyond what was already on the maintenance schedule. I started to wonder if the whole arrangement was less about building logistics and more about something I didn't have a clean word for yet. I didn't let myself think about that too directly. The third Monday, he had coffee waiting. 2 cups, black, on the low table between the chairs. He didn't mention it, and I didn't thank him for it, because something told me that would make it into a thing, and neither of us seemed to want that. I drank it and kept going through the checklist, and he listened the way he always did, with that specific quality of attention that I still hadn't gotten used to. At some point, I mentioned that the ventilation contractor had pushed back the service date without notice, and I was handling it. He asked who the contractor was. I told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he knew someone who could have it done by Thursday. I told him I had it covered. He looked at me in a way that wasn't pushback exactly, more like recalibration. Like he'd expected a different answer and was adjusting. I didn't know why that felt important, but it did. Thursday, the contractor called me to reschedule for Wednesday. I didn't ask how that happened. Some things are easier not to examine. What I did examine, more than I should have, was the brief moment on that third visit when I was standing near the window, pointing out a hairline crack in the exterior frame that maintenance needed to log, and he came to stand beside me to look at it, close enough that I was aware of the warmth of him, the way his presence had a kind of gravity that wasn't aggressive, just real. He leaned in slightly to see the crack better, and for about 4 seconds we were both looking at the same small, inconsequential thing, and I was not thinking about the crack at all. He straightened up and said the frame had been like that since he moved in, and I said we should have caught it sooner, and he said it wasn't urgent, and I wrote it down anyway because I needed something to do with my hands. That evening my sister called and asked how the new job was going. I said it was fine. The building was well managed. The residents were mostly low maintenance. She asked about mostly. I told her one of them was a little harder to read. She said that was usually either very boring or very interesting. I said I hadn't decided yet. She laughed and changed the subject, and I let her. Because the honest answer was that I had already decided, and I just didn't want to say it out loud. The next Monday I arrived at 10 and knocked and waited, and no one came to the door. I stood there for a moment, then knocked again. Nothing. The elevator was still there behind me. I should have taken it. Instead, I stood in that quiet foyer for another 30 seconds, waiting, which told me more about where I was than anything else had so far. I took the elevator down and told myself it was nothing. Schedules change, people have meetings. It wasn't personal and it wasn't significant, and I was not going to spend the rest of the day thinking about it. I spent the rest of the day thinking about it. Not obsessively, just the way you think about something that doesn't quite resolve, a low hum in the background of everything else. I filed the maintenance report, handled a noise complaint on the 9th floor, sat through a vendor call that ran 20 minutes long, and somewhere in all of that kept returning to the image of that closed door and the particular feeling of standing on the wrong side of it. By Wednesday, I had talked myself into a reasonable explanation. By Thursday, a note had been slid under my office door. Not an email, an actual note, folded once, my name on the front in handwriting that was clean and unhurried. It said Monday had come up unexpectedly. It said Thursday at 10, if that worked. It didn't ask. It didn't apologize. It just stated, the way he seemed to state everything, and left the decision to me. I wrote back on building stationery and left it with the front desk for the penthouse. It said, Thursday worked. I did not examine how quickly I wrote that. Thursday was different from the start. He opened the door before I knocked, which meant he had heard the elevator, which meant he had been paying attention to when I arrived. I filed that away without comment. The apartment felt slightly different. A jacket over one of the chairs, a glass on the counter that hadn't been there before, small signs of a morning that hadn't been staged. It made the space feel more real somehow, more inhabited. We went through the usual items, but the rhythm was off in a way that wasn't uncomfortable, just noticeable. He was slightly less contained than usual, not open, That wasn't a word I would ever use for him, but present in a different way, like something that had been running quietly in the background had been turned up a notch. At one point, I mentioned that the building's annual inspection was coming up and that I'd need access to all units for a half-day walkthrough. He said that was fine. I said I'd send the formal notice along with everyone else's. He said he'd prefer I came myself. I looked up from the clipboard. He was looking back at me with that same expression from the elevator foyer weeks ago, the one I still hadn't found the right word for. I said that wasn't standard procedure. He said he was aware of that. The air in the room did something I chose not to name. I wrote a note on the clipboard that said nothing useful and told him I'd see what I could arrange. Walking back to the elevator, I was very focused on keeping my pace normal, unhurried, professional. The doors closed. I exhaled, and then my phone buzzed with a message from Derek, asking if everything was okay with the penthouse resident, because he'd seemed, quote, unusually engaged in the staffing process. I stared at that message for a long time before I typed back that everything was fine. I wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. The annual inspection gave me a legitimate reason to be in every unit in the building, which meant it also gave me a legitimate reason to be in his. I told myself that was the only reason I had agreed to do the penthouse walkthrough personally. It was a reasonable explanation. It was also not entirely honest. I scheduled it for a Friday morning, last unit of the day, which I justified logistically and didn't examine beyond that. The other 41 units took most of the morning. By the time I stepped off the private elevator, it was almost noon, and I was tired in the specific way that comes from being professionally pleasant for 4 hours straight. He opened the door, and I could tell immediately that he had been working. There were papers on the dining table, a laptop open, the focused residue of interrupted concentration. He looked at me, and then at the clipboard and said, "You actually came yourself." I said I told him I'd see what I could arrange. Something almost moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, close enough to make my chest do something I ignored. The walkthrough took longer than the others, not because there was more to inspect, but because the space was larger, and because he followed at a distance that was respectful and somehow still felt close. I checked the windows, the ventilation, the water fixtures, the fire safety equipment. He watched without commenting, which I had learned by now was just how he existed in a room, present without being intrusive, attentive without performing it. We reached the last room, a study off the main hallway, and I noted a smoke detector that needed a battery replacement. I reached up to check the panel, and it was just slightly too high, and before I could adjust my footing, he was beside me, close enough that I felt the shift in the air before I registered his actual proximity. He reached past me and pressed the test button, his arm near enough to mine that I was acutely aware of the warmth of it. The detector beeped twice. He lowered his arm and stepped back, and I wrote something on the clipboard that I would later realize was completely illegible. I cleared my throat and said I'd send maintenance up for the battery. He said he'd take care of it. I nodded and capped my pen, and that should have been the end of it. The clean, professional conclusion I had been planning all morning. Instead, he said, "Have you eaten?" I looked up. He was watching me with an expression that was careful in a way that felt deliberate, like a man who had decided to say something and was monitoring the consequences in real time. I said it was almost noon, and I had a full afternoon. He said that wasn't what he asked. The room was very quiet. I was aware of my own heartbeat in a way that was inconvenient and clarifying at the same time. I said I hadn't eaten since 7. He said, "Then stay." Not a question, not quite a command. Something in between that I didn't have a category for. And the part that unsettled me most wasn't that he asked. It was that I was already trying to decide if I had a good enough reason to say no. I stayed. That was the first decision. The one that came before all the others. He didn't make a production of it. No elaborate meal, no deliberate atmosphere. He moved to the kitchen with the same economy he brought to everything else, and I sat at the counter on one of the bar stools and set my clipboard down for the first time all morning and felt the unfamiliar sensation of not having something to do with my hands. He made eggs. That detail stayed with me afterward, the plainness of it. Not because it was romantic, but because it wasn't. Because it was just a person feeding another person at noon on a Friday, which was somehow more disarming than anything deliberate could have been. We talked while he cooked. Not about the building. He asked about the inspection process, how I'd gotten into facilities management, and I gave him the honest answer, which was that I was good at solving problems, and the job had found me more than the other way around. He listened without filling the pauses, which was a quality I had started to notice and value more than I expected to. I asked how long he'd been in New York. He said 7 years. I asked if he liked it. He said it was useful. I laughed before I could decide whether to, and he looked over at me with an expression that was almost caught off guard, like the sound had landed somewhere he hadn't prepared for. We ate at the counter. The food was simple and good, and the conversation moved in the unhurried way of two people who had quietly decided to stop pretending they were there for professional reasons. At some point, the light through the windows shifted, and I realized it was past 1, and I had 3 things on my afternoon schedule that were going to require actual attention. I said I needed to go. He said he knew. Neither of us moved for a moment. Then I picked up the clipboard, and he walked me to the elevator the way he always did. And we stood in that brief transitional space while the doors opened. I stepped in and turned around, and he was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, watching me with an expression I had been cataloging for weeks without arriving at a clean definition. I said I'd send the maintenance note about the smoke detector. He said my name. Not Ms. Dresser, just Calla. First time. It stopped me the way unexpected things stop you. Not dramatically, just completely. He said, "Same time next week." The doors closed. I rode down 42 floors with my clipboard pressed against my chest, and the particular awareness of a person who has just crossed a line they didn't see marked on the ground. I wasn't afraid exactly. I was something more complicated than that. That evening, I was at my desk finishing reports when my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't have saved, which I somehow already knew wasn't a coincidence. It said, "There's a reception at the building next Friday evening. Building management is expected to attend." I read it twice. Then I scrolled up and confirmed there was no prior message, no introduction, nothing to indicate how he had gotten my personal number or when he had decided to use it. I set the phone down, picked it up again. The professional response was obvious. The honest response was that I wasn't thinking about the professional angle at all. I was thinking about the way he had said my name, and I was thinking about Friday. That was part 1 of this story, and if you made it this far, I genuinely appreciate you. Drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments and let me know what you think so far. Your feedback is what makes part 2 possible. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, things are about to get a lot more interesting. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.